Hey, Jeff, did you get the minutes?
I did. I haven't read them yet, but I did get the minutes.
That's what we're going to go through that first.
There's not much to that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Debbie.
Okay, we're live.
Thanks, Sally. Call a meeting of the Ethics Board to order. This is an open meeting. Just so we know, do we have other participants other than the ad hoc committee and the Ethics Board?
Sally?
I'm sorry.
I said, is there I don't see anybody else on other than the ad hoc committee. And
there's 3 people who are attendees.
Right, and just me and Christy. That's all.
Okay, great, thanks. So the first order of business, and sorry to make you all sit through this, and then we'll introduce each other, is to get our minutes approved. So Debbie, you want to lead us through that? I've reviewed them completely.
Yeah, I will do it very quickly. So I sent Yoram and Jeff and Mark, I sent you 6 minutes for 6 meetings, August 3rd, 14th, 17th, September 14th, 17th, and October 6th. All of these we were discussing, we were going into executive session for advice and counsel, or to meet with the Board of Trustees as co-defendants in the Goldstein litigation, except for the meeting of August 3rd, where in public session, we approved some minutes and reported on the annual disclosure form process and how it was going. So other than that, there's really not much to these minutes, but as one of my last acts, I'd love to get them taken care of. And I think, Mark, I think
These were some emails that he sent to me about,
you know,
we could try to work in.
Somebody's talking in the background. If you can mute your, hit your mute button, that would help. Thanks. Just go ahead, Debbie.
so I think, I think we could do it all in one motion. You know,
Sure.
so these nice people from the ad hoc committee don't have to sit for 6 different motions. They got enough hurt ahead of them.
Well, I know Yoram's looked at him and I looked at him. Jeff, why don't you?
Yeah, I just looked at them too.
So I'll take a motion to approve all the minutes circulated and referred to by Debbie Chapin.
I'll so move.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, motion carries.
Thank you.
So welcome ad hoc committee to the Ethics Board meeting. We're happy to have this meeting with you. We don't, you know, we're happy to go around the room and introduce ourselves. Maybe that's appropriate. And then Dan, I was going to turn it over to you since you have, you've got the agenda, I think.
Sure.
So I'll start. I'm Mark Ettenger. I've lived in town for 27 years. I've been on the ethics board since 2015, became chair, I think, in 2017, and have, at least in that period, been involved in any matter that's taken place, legislative or compliance or what have you, since that time. Why don't we just go around, at least the way I'm looking at Yoram, why don't you're up.
Yeah, Yoram Miller. I've been in the village about 17 years, and on the ethics committee, this is my 2nd year.
Debbie?
I'm Debbie Chapin. I've been in the village 35 years, I believe, although I grew up in the town. I'm a former mayor of the village of Mamaroneck, and like Yoram and Mark, and I'll preview Jeff's statement also. I'm a retired attorney. Some of them are practicing attorneys, some are retired attorneys. But
You're never retired.
I'm a recovering attorney.
Oh, there you go.
And I've served on a lot of not-for-profit boards in the community and elsewhere.
Jeff?
My name is Jeff Megan. I've been a resident of the tri-community area all my life. And I'm with a family law firm in Mamaroneck that dates back to 1897.
Which is when you began practicing, no doubt. And,
I haven't been practicing that long, although some days it feels like it.
okay, Dan?
Hi, I'm Dan Karson. Thank you all for tearing yourselves away from the television screen to meet with us at this time. I can tell you it's a welcome respite for me from the, we're all over caffeinated here watching what's going on. I'm Dan Karson. I have been a resident of the village of Mamaroneck for 28 years, raised our boys here, and most recently managed the Larchmont Temple softball team to the Westchester Hebrew Softball League Championship as of
Yay.
Hey, all right.
Which is no small feat.
Yes.
So I just thought I'd throw that in there because we're still kind of euphoric from having won.
Did you play by the rules?
What's that?
I was joking. I said, did you play by the rules?
Oh, we actually, now that you bring it up, and I won't dwell on it, we have in our league what's known as the Mensch rule, which means that we don't adhere to very, very strict rules, and we want most of all to have fun, and so we refer to if somebody commits an act that is not sportsmanlike, we say that they violated the Mensch rule. So. I will ask the other members of the ad hoc committee to introduce themselves now.
Well, I'm Jocelyn Donat. I've been a resident of the village for the past 20 years. This is my first role on the ad hoc committee. And in the spirit of the softball team, looking to just have a lot of fun. No, I'm kidding. So I am a human resources executive for in financial services.
Thank you.
I'm Ellen Houtman. I've been a resident of the village for 25 years. In addition to being on this committee, I'm on the village budget committee where I've been for 2 years. This past budget cycle was quite challenging due to the pandemic. And looking at our actuals is even more challenging as we're rolling through the year. And I also, like Jocelyn, have a financial services background.
I'm John Hofstetter. I'm a former trustee in the village of Mamaroneck, 3 terms. Worked in publishing for about 15 years, and now I'm a real estate broker. I've served on the budget committee and on the library board of directors, board of trustees, and served in other services or other committees throughout the village over my time here, and look forward to working with everybody.
Thank you.
I am Brian Kerr. I lived in Mamaroneck my whole life for 25 years with my parents. Thank you, Mom and Dad. I just graduated from Pace Law School in May, and I'm awaiting the bar exam results, which should be in December. They should have been here in October, but thank you, COVID. So they'll be here in December.
You have our condolences.
Yeah, that's a long wait, having gone through it.
Thank you.
A long wait. Well, we're happy to be here. We want to help.
I think Michael is, we have one more.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, one more. I felt left out there. That's all right. I'm Michael Copey. I am a 56-year resident of the village. I have served on a number of search committees for village managers in the village. I was also the fire chief, and I am a member of the fire department for almost 40 years. Currently, I do emergency management for the state of New York.
thank you.
Okay.
You're being modest, Mike.
I guess I should add also that I'm a practicing lawyer of more than 47 years and have served on a couple of village committees as well. Mark, may I begin? Any other comments before we start?
Sure, please do.
Okay, first of all, thank you again for taking the time to spend with us. By way of introduction, our ad hoc committee was created by the Board of Trustees of Mamaroneck on September the 14th. Officially, we are charged with reviewing the village's current code of ethics to identify its strengths, limitations, and opportunities for improvement, review ethics codes and standards from other municipalities, and make a report and recommendation to the Board of Trustees no later than December 31, 2020, identifying specific amendments to be considered and other best management practices of the village. That December 31 date is, in my opinion, very aspirational. But for now, we're going to do what we can to see if we can meet it. Our intention in meeting or request to meet with you is to learn about the function of the Board of Ethics and to ask you your views on the current Board Code of Ethics and what changes, if any, you would suggest. We are very, very much focused prospectively on evaluating the Code of Ethics. We are not conducting an investigation. We were not appointed to review any specific matters considered by the board or any litigation that has arisen as a result of board matters or any other committee matters. Our strict mandate and charter is to look at the current Code of Ethics and see how we can, if at all, improve it. So I think we're all happy to answer any questions you may have about how we were impaneled. And I invite my fellow members of the ad hoc committee to jump in as they see fit. I'll take the liberty of asking the first question, just generally ask an open question as to what are your views of the current Code of Ethics and where, if at all, you think it needs improvement or revision, and what changes in the code would you recommend? If you want to ask a prefatory question, though, about what we're doing here, before answering that question, please do so. But that's my opening question.
You know, at least as we understand it, the code was adopted in 2009 with the express intent. And those of you who lived in the village at that time may remember the environment that preceded it to enhance the ethical standards within the village, the conduct of officials within the village, and expressly made it in some areas more specific, one might say stricter than, which the code specifically allows and contemplates, stricter than state law in a couple of particular areas. In my 5 years, I found it a very workable code. Heard sort of a number of informal and some formal complaints, as well as we've operated the annual and other disclosure requirements of the code. I don't think we found any problems in the law as it relates to the annual disclosure. We found lots of problems in compliance throughout the village, top to bottom, bottom to top, however you want to look at it. Some just because people have busy lives, some for other reasons, but at least if you think of annual disclosure as the simple cornerstone, along with the policy statement, that portion of the code seems to work well in terms of what the law requires. In that specific area, I think we would all think, we've been to the board several times about this, that if you're on this board, you would spend a substantial amount of time writing folks who don't submit it, asking them to correct everything, a lot of clerical issues. I think the form could be slightly improved, but it's if there was any change, I would suggest there, just to throw something out, it would be to have some teeth in the compliance because as everybody on this phone call from the board, ethics board knows, we spend months of time gaining compliance by folks. And that is, again, the cornerstone, because it's in that annual disclosure that every village official subject to it is to disclose, essentially, in the broadest terms, their possible conflicts or actual conflicts. So I'd say that's an area that could be improved in terms of compliance mechanisms. Both we sent out multiple letters of, reminder letters, but that to me is the cornerstone of the code, which is transparency. Since no one said anything, that one other comment on disclosure, again, because it is the cornerstone of the code. We have requested multiple times that, and the statute requires that the list of officials who are subject to the code be updated. Interestingly, in the village of Mamaroneck, we have quite a few people who file voluntarily because they know they should be subject to the code because their positions are such that on a parallel or analog basis to the other filers only makes sense that they would file. So the first thing I would focus on is the annual disclosure form and creating some ability after some period of time to have some teeth in the statute, because there really, it is an undue use of volunteer time to simply track folks down to file something that's statutorily required.
And Sally Roberts' time.
And it's a great point. Historically, Sally and I spend, and Yoram did it this year, spend a tremendous amount of time gaining compliance with simple filing.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I'll follow up a little bit with some of what Mark said as well. One of the things that we discovered in speaking to people whenever an issue would come up, even at the early investigation stage, is people were genuinely afraid of how they would be perceived as, talking to us, and sort of the consequences if someone who was lower level was complaining about someone senior to them. And I know in a lot of the brouhaha that led to the ad hoc committee itself, there was a lot of talk about we should be identifying the accusers. And it's something that I really hope, we take very seriously, because to us, the quasi-anonymous tips and sort of the whistleblowers, we can't do the job without having people feel comfortable coming to us. And really, I know there's a sort of gut instinct to let's make everything as transparent as possible. But I really would, the code is written with a presumption that everything is confidential, and what happens at the ethics committee's investigations and who we speak to is confidential. I'd really implore whatever happens to maintain that and even strengthen it, because we definitely encountered situations that we talked to village employees and they were clearly uncomfortable because of the perceived ramifications of talking to us. And knowing that then it was sort of widely discussed in the village that anybody that spoke to us, that should come out and be public. I would really implore you not, to protect the confidentiality, the whistleblowers, also the witnesses that we'd speak to. And this ties into another issue that I know came up, and I don't think we could have done our job without it, which is the subpoena power itself. Mark can speak longer than me, but it's my understanding in the last half decade, the ethics committee's only used the subpoena power twice.
Right.
But just when we talk to people and employees, and we'd say to them, if it makes you more comfortable, we can issue a subpoena so you don't have to be viewed as a rat who's, sort of speaking against people, but just feel comfortable to know that it's just part of the village code, and it's part of your job to speak to us and give them that cover. That's something I'd really, again, I'd hate to lose. Plus, when we do investigations, and we haven't done many at all, but some people are really viewed as a part of their responsibility and are very cooperative and helpful. and others, if it wasn't for just the threat of a subpoena, we wouldn't get documents or we wouldn't be able to talk to people. And so, you know, we've been very judicious in how we've used it. I'm assuming that predated our time on the board. I'm sure it will be with future board members. But having that subpoena power, it really is necessary. Otherwise, you're going to be just chasing investigations with no ability to get the information to actually do the investigations. And related to that, most everything we've done ends up getting resolved cooperatively. I don't think there's any intention from the ethics board, and the code itself, I think, is written this way that between the advisory opinions and just the general discussions, most everything gets resolved amicably and without anybody outside of the ethics board and the person we're speaking to knowing about it. Even the advisory opinions, the ability to keep sufficient information out of the public eye so that when people come to us, they can feel comfortable coming to us with potentially embarrassing questions. We can issue an opinion that that person can rely on. We can redact enough of it that the village as a whole can benefit from whatever the decision was without the person that came to us ever being identified. Again, that's the one thing I'd really hope we keep that spirit that's within the code of encouraging ethical behavior, trying to raise the standard of conduct, and at the same time really respecting everybody involved in the process and their privacy, because we do deal with issues that people don't want to have public and aren't even comfortable talking about, and to give them the greatest comfort before they start approaching the ethics board or speaking to us, it's really something critical, and I hope gets maintained.
Hey, Yoram, let me just break it down
Sure.
into two pieces. Let's just start with the sort of the general notion of whistleblower, which there is a statutory provision. I think it's the last provision of the code. It's a bit ambiguous, and we have previously suggested it be more protective. You said investigations. The reality is, since I've been on the board, I think we have done three in total, only three true investigations. And you have to break down the process. So it's really as much and only three in at least my 5 years. Two, just for kicks, the first one was a matter brought by a former official against a current official, and that of the same party, and we looked into that and concluded it was not worthy of, that was one investigator, worthy of any type of enforcement action. And the second one was the Santoro matter, and the third was the Goldstein matter. But that would represent, other than the Goldstein matter, which did have a sort of take a tremendous amount of resources, that would be a relatively small part of what we deal with. You know, I get, and this is my concern, I have a list of a number of, let's call them calls I've gotten, and others get them, where serious violations are disclosed with the, let's call it the usually another village official or often village staff, concerned about some conduct that they saw or pattern, who call and then do nothing. You know, we've only acted on one matter ever on our own that I'm aware of without a formal complaint, but there we had so many calls that by people who were also fearful. So the whistleblower statute's important not only at the investigatory stage, but prior to that. So I believe that what Yoram says of that being critical is the case. On subpoena, as he said, we only issued 2 of them, although I know part of the impetus here, at least what I heard from the dais, was both as to wide-ranging investigations as well as, what do you want to call it? I can't remember what the adjective was, but too liberal use of subpoena power, which neither of which we understood, having everybody on this board, with the exception of me, has only done 1 investigation in their years on the board. So we don't have that problem that's been commented on. On the subpoenas, as Yoram said, we've done 2, but in the casual conversations you have with people, it's not so much the threat, it's more the discussion. When someone comes to you with, and it's usually about somebody, could be trustee, it could be staff member, official, it could be in every direction one could imagine. The person is no one calls like, there's no gung ho. I've never gotten a call that says, you've got to look at this. It's very timid, usually very fearful, very concerned about, when they say rocking the boat, worried about their own career path. And we have seen, I'm aware of people who have left the village with respect to matters like we're discussing. So I think it's really important to make it clear at every level, and maybe even to the point where trying to uncover a whistleblower or a tip or a witness when it's otherwise confidential should be proscribed, because we face that as well. This issue of who is the accuser. I think most people, anybody with law school knows that the right to face an accuser is trumped to a great extent, other than Sixth Amendment issues, criminal cases, by whistleblower statutes. But we need to protect the information flow. And we have seen it in recent times, the idea that should be protected be actually attacked. If you listen to public comments during the public hearing, May 27th, you'll hear people, saying that constitutional rights were being abridged. But the purpose here is to have people who are particularly in a subordinate position or fearful that they would have retribution that could hurt either their ability to conduct policy, to do business. I think it's a very serious issue that we have learned a lot about in the last year or so that should be addressed. Whistleblowers, protection of people who come forth, and I'd say a proscription against attempting to figure out or out such a person. And that's in the code, what I just referred to, but it's very gentle.
If I may, so the code itself, and John Hofstetter was on the board when they approved it. My understanding of what the board did at that time was they intentionally tried to pass a law that was far more in depth than New York state law. And they wanted to, do something that would be a model for other communities. And if you look at the legislative history of it, which is scant, but there are quotes from then Mayor Kathy Sabo saying, this is something other municipalities will be looking to us for. I think overall the law is a good one. It does require some tweaking. I think I've been on the board almost 3 years, and I think in the first year and a half or so that I was on the Board of Ethics, we recommended, I think, 4 or 5 different changes to the law to the Board of Trustees. None of which, one we actually went to a work session on 2 occasions to talk to them about it. But they ended up not making any of those changes. And so I think that while there's some tinkering to be done with the code, and there are some big questions like, how do you balance due process with confidentiality? The code itself, it is good. It's overly complicated in some places, like transactional disclosure, which is kind of burdensome. And in fact, I think we recommended some changes to that particular provision. I think the bigger problem is, and this is not something you can legislate, is that ethics violations are often brought to the Board of Ethics kind of sotto voce. If you ask people to sign a sworn complaint, they say no, thank you. And so there's this perception that the Board of Ethics is, trolling LMC TV and trying to find, trying to trick people up and gotcha, which is not the case. with
For what it's worth,
Jeff Egan, who is the chair of the LMC board.
Right.
So, and then as a corollary to all that, things get politicized. So I mean, we've seen, and this predates this board, you know, we've seen elected officials call us up about other elected officials. We've seen village employees call and officers call us up. And we've tried to impress upon the elected officials how serious certain things are and where the law should be changed, and have not had any success in doing that. So I think maybe one of the things you should look at is whether or not the oath of office that elected officials and volunteers sign, I think they sign, yeah, I don't remember exactly who signs it, include, you know, following the code of ethics of the village of Mamaroneck.
Hey, Debbie, let me just jump in 1 second. It's not only the oath only refers to state law, right, Debbie?
Right. The oath of office, which I asked Sally Roberts to send me several months ago, talks about, you know, I swear to uphold the Constitution of the state of New York, which is one of the most ridiculous documents, you know, ever created. I mean, if you've ever read the Constitution of the state of New York, it's insane.
By the way, I have.
God bless you.
It's
I was on a committee. I was on one of the committees that tried to get a constitutional convention going.
It's crazy. So I think one of the things that maybe you can do legislatively is elevate the awareness of what the code is and how people must adhere to it. You know, and then the other thing we should say is that most of the issues that we've seen have to do with land use board members. And so maybe the rules for land use board members and elected officials need to be different from mere mortals.
Would you repeat that, Debbie? I don't think I quite understood that.
So land use board members, look, it's no secret that the impetus for your committee comes out of the Board of Ethics and the Goldstein matter. And it's also no secret that I think in the summer of 2019, we went to the village board and said, you know, it would be really helpful if the village code said, if you live within the notice area, if you get notice of the land use matter, you shouldn't be sitting on the deciding board. And I think it's harder, for example, on the budget committee to find a conflict of interest on the budget committee is different from finding a conflict of interest on land use matter. Our code also requires board members to identify themselves as board members when they come before another board, and to tell the board of trustees that they have done that. That's the transactional disclosure. You know, I'm not sure if Ellen goes to the recreation committee that she should disclose that she's on the budget committee. I mean, I don't, you know, but I think if someone is on the zoning board and goes before the planning board, they should probably say so, you know. So I think you should read it.
And the law requires it.
And the law requires it, yeah. So I think you should read it with the idea that most of our issues have been related to, other than the purely political ones, where political enemies, either inter-party or of a different party, you know, come to us. Most of the issues, I think, Mark, have been related to land use board members.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, when I got on the board, I'm trying to remember. I think other than the Santoro matter, and there's another thing is, which is good. If there is if a matter comes before us, let's say by sworn complaint, there's a set of rules as to what can be disclosed or what has to be disclosed about the disposition of the complaint. Many of these matters never come to public, not that I say many, there aren't many, but few come to public light because, and I've always thought this was an important part of the job. I mean, you're looking at 5 people here who had, Jeff, actually, when I moved here 27 years ago, some broker suggested that he represent me on my house closing, but we haven't worked, none of us have any prior or social or real meaningful relationship. We didn't even know what parties we were in when we actually started working together. But I think it's almost, other than the Santoro matter, I would say, other than village trustees, I should say that, because we had a lot of village trustee calls. But I think before I say it, I'm thinking through my mental list. I think every matter we've gotten, with the exception of a matter regarding, let's call it the use of boats in the municipal docking area, has involved land use. Every inquiry, almost every, put aside trustees, I think every matter that I can think of has been an issue with respect to a land use board member. And it makes sense, because that is an area that is more monetary, more fraught with conflicts,
Saying with respect to matters before the Board of Ethics, that most of them are land use matters?
Say it again, Dan, you broke up.
Is what you just said, that most of the business of the Board of Ethics involves land use matters?
I would say most of the compliance, or outside of annual disclosures, which is just a 5-month, frankly, if anybody else did it, nightmare because of the inability to get people to do it. Anything that colloquially you might think of as a matter, something that raised an issue of application of the statute, either informally, i.e. calling up a land use board member and saying, hey, I got a call, you spoke before the planning board, you're a ZBA member, you may not know it, you're supposed to disclose this. You get various reactions to that. But then the person sends a 3-sentence letter, nothing onerous, nothing admitting guilt or anything, and it's over. Those no one knows about those. But whether it's those types of issues or actual complaints, either formal or call them whistleblower, I can't think of one that didn't involve either a village trustee or a land use member, with the one exception of this dock issue. But that has been, in 5 years, that has been the pattern. And the pattern shifted. It was I remember being told when I joined the board by the prior board, there was a judge on it, a doctor, all sorts of people, that we try to keep the village friendly, because you had in between, you had one member of a party accusing a member of another party. You had all sorts of stuff going on. You have some let's call them, activists in town who are more active in filing complaints or involved in the perimeters of this stuff. But most of it is whether it's informal, formal, that you wouldn't see because the person wasn't found in violation. The one land use case that did become a true investigation hearing where the person was convicted, that's of course public. But it's all land use. That's not to say there couldn't be someone's taking, you could find a village, I guess you could find somebody, did something unethical to get an extra tree planted, but that's not the kind of stuff we hear about.
Ad hoc committee members, any questions from you guys?
One thing I would say the subpoena power, I didn't say, Yoram used the word threat, and I don't think we've ever actually it's never been used as a, like, if you don't do it, it's not like that, but it's knowing it's out there, both from a protective point of view for the witness, because people say, well, if I come forward, will you subpoena me so I don't feel like I'm just voluntarily coming? You get that quite a bit. Or in a recent matter, we had reason to believe that we weren't going to get materials that we had part of, and we knew there were more, there had to be, and it was necessary. But that is something to use very judiciously and not broadly.
And the other thing is that I think it was Nora Lucas who set up a training session for volunteers in the Village of Mamaroneck through NICOM, the New York Conference of Mayors. And a guy, I think his name was Mancini, came down and did it. Yoram and I both went. And one of the things he said was, not all ethics committees have investigatory powers. If you do provide for investigatory powers, you must provide subpoena power, because otherwise.
Sorry, you must provide what?
Subpoena power.
Provide subpoena power.
Yeah, because investigatory power without subpoena power, it just doesn't do it. But as Mark says, I mean, I've only been on the board for 3 years, and this is not something we have done frequently.
We've only done it twice in the same matter. I mean,
Right.
it's been just, I can tell you for, just because it's anecdotal, that there have been situations where it's been discussed in the past, but, people were very judicious, very careful in where that might be used. And I think the fact it's only been used in one case, one kind of, as I describe it, as an accommodation, and the other because we had very strong reasons to believe it was necessary. We wouldn't have thought, if you had said, is there an issue? I heard this comment made about that Trustee Lucas made about, I think it was her, about the subpoena. I was like, I didn't really even, sorry about that, understand it in a sense, because we had never faced it as an issue. It was something that, of course, we would use. Extraordinary. The proof of the pudding is twice in 5 years, and I'm not aware from my debrief from the prior boards that they had used it, but it could have been used somewhere else. We would not have thought of it as an issue that needed correction. We need the village attorney to guide people through what's a standard, a reasonable standard, but once that is established, it's not, we wouldn't have thought of it as an issue at all. Wouldn't have crossed our minds.
Debbie touched on training, and of course the state is one thing. We have a little bit of a different code, but I think that there ought to be some local training, and particularly of those members on land use boards, of what's appropriate and giving local examples and so on. I think that's where it starts. As Mark said, there's nothing that creates the emotions of citizens other than land use boards, with somebody coming into the neighborhood to do something, but, and it provides good TV. But the training ought to be very practical and very much centered towards the land use boards and to others too, but more of a use of that. Plus, I think there ought to be more publication of the fact that people can use us for advisory opinions. If you're really in a quandary about whether you should say something or appear or whatever, or how you should do it, ask and you shall receive.
Yeah, I mean, I have a list, I can't really go through it because it's confidential, but a list of officials who have come to us and sought either informal or formal advice. We've taken it very, very seriously. By the way, on the training, as the board knows, we have asked to do training for a number of years. I don't want to say 5, but it might be 5. I think the statute needs to not only mandate that training be done, which it does, but it should mandate a reason. I don't know how you do this, and maybe Ellen will have an insight in this when you guys all talk, but it ought to mandate resources, because if you want to do training, you know, we're all just like you, citizen volunteers. You need resources. You need some village staff to help you. You may need some dollars for printing materials. You know, it's just without the BOT specifically saying yes when asked and specifically dedicating resources, it is a very difficult task to do.
Mark, I'm in the process of trying to find out what the state offers on an annual basis.
Yeah, well,
That
there is.
perhaps
The
could
problem,
mandate.
yeah, I see what you're saying in terms of money. Yeah, I don't know. I know that we weren't given the resources and asked for them.
Yep.
And we you know, that dovetails frankly with some of the legislative stuff, but
I did go to a class the state offered today on conflict of interest. But there was no indication on how often it was offered.
Right. And the conflict of interest provisions in New York state law under Article 18 are so very different from the conflict of interest, you know, I mean, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the conflict of interest law for the state has provisions that the village doesn't seem to apply either.
like,
As we were going through the course today, I found it very interesting that there is a conflict is proscribed. You even if you disclose, there's still there are issues where disclosure does not absolve.
Correct.
Somebody.
and by the way,
And we have historically in the village allowed people to disclose and move on, and participate in business transactions with the village that, according to the way I heard in the class today, would be proscribed. They're not allowed.
well, I wasn't in that course. I mean, if you were to disclose that, disclosure doesn't, for example, cure the recusal provisions, which is the ultimate answer to conflict, right? That you don't participate in a matter where you have a conflict, however one defines conflict. I suspect, John, but I'm not sure because I don't know. Yeah, if I knew, you know, we haven't had this matter come to us, which is rise to another issue, probably embedded in our earlier comments, that you know, disclosure should not be a cure, and I don't really think it is. It may be treated or may have been treated in practice inappropriately, or perhaps because there's no complaint, formal or informal, that the then ethics board didn't know about it, or the state compliance folks didn't know. But that is not under the current statute. It's not exculpatory because you disclose. If you have a conflict that would require recusal, you have to recuse even if you disclose. But I'm sure there's something in state we just don't know, John, about.
So Mark, I think it would be helpful if we came up with, they're on a tight time schedule, but the list of legislative changes that we know, you know, in your 5 years have been proposed formally or informally to the Board of Trustees, because that will give you an indication of how working with the code, shortcomings have made themselves known.
Have you made recommendations to the current board?
Yes.
Yes, and they've been rejected?
We have made, let me try to answer it in a broader context. So that is, when I got on the board, you know, there's some good people. They gave me a bunch of materials, and I could see that legislative changes had been suggested before. But I can speak in the 5 years that I've been on the board, and we can give you this. We have had 2 different village attorneys draft legislation. We have that legislation drafted. We have a list of, I would say, because we do think the code works. We don't see fundamental problems in the code, whether it's an application. We see political the fractious environment that we're in causing issues and prior fractious environments causing issues.
Or lack of training.
Or lack of training, it could be, but we haven't seen, and there's some definitions in Debbie was about transactional disclosure that could be improved, and we suggest that, but we have made, Ellen, I have a list that I actually was putting together to send to either as part of a report by our whole board or just sort of a, hey, here's my, as I get off this board, here's my list of unfinished stuff. But we can supply you over the coming weeks with a detailed memo list and actual draft legislation.
That would be terrific.
You know, most recently, we provided very detailed draft legislation. You know, one of the things that I suspect John and others that have been in village government for years have heard is there's this concern that if you know, when recusal issues have come up, we've been, you know, requested, don't do anything. If you do, there's already 2 recusals with a 3rd, that'll mess up the matter. It'll be deemed disapproval, blah, you know, all that kind of stuff. When the real issue isn't that, the real issue is, should the person be hearing the matter if there is, I'm not saying that, if there is indeed a conflict, which we'll come back around to talking about. So I would just say we have applied very detailed legislative suggestions to this board and the, you know, the prior board, same people generally, without action, response, constructive dialogue, etc.
So nothing that you have in your tenure on the board proposed through this legislation has been adopted, or components, or just nothing has been?
I mean, even down to Jocelyn asking them to update the list, which is statutorily required from 2009, has been not responded to.
Right, frankly, even asking them, New York state law says no gifts to an employee or officer in excess of $75. Our code says $50. We said, hey, it really should match state law. Didn't get that.
There's been no response.
Especially with inflation.
Right.
And maybe it should
Exactly.
be $2.
Right.
We're hopeful. We are hopeful. I can say I'm very hopeful, having worked on all this legislation. I mean, that you all will do a better job than we were able to do, or be more successful. I mean, this draft.
Mark, can I ask one?
Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry, it's Michael Copey. You said about 2 minutes ago, you said you felt the code was good, but that there were problems. Did you say the problems were political? And if that was correct, can you just expand on that a little bit for me?
Sure. I mean, there's some technical problems in the statute. I'll give you an example. You try to read the ongoing disclosure, like what happens, take Debbie's example. You show up, you're on the zoning board, and you show up to a planning board meeting because you care about the matter that's there, whether or not it's been to you or not. You know, I would have thought it would have been pretty obvious. You let people know who you are, and the statute requires it, but the statute's a little bit messy there, Mike. And so it's mainly been educating people, and I think education would work there. I think that there's a predominance of the complaints that emanate out of political disagreements between people, or, you know, are even if the matter isn't related to the disagreement, the nature of politics in this town is that politicians make complaints about other politicians. And I remember being told when I got on the board that part of our job was to sort that through to keep the village friendly. So in today's, you know, world, you know, things, you know, in my judgment, I think everybody would agree, going back to Yoram's opening comment, you know, officials who are political by nature should not be, you know, trying to evoke an answer on who's the whistleblower, who's the accuser. I mean, they can't. How do you have a system that relies on subordinates when the politicos will, challenge the fact that stuff that is statutorily confidential isn't being disclosed. So I think, protecting the whistleblower because remember, everybody that's subject to this we still haven't had an employee, right? It's always appointed officials, or we have one sort of employee issue, a police issue years ago, but we determined it wasn't in our jurisdiction. But it by nature is the appointed or elected officials appointed by elected officials, or the elected officials themselves who have let's say tried to break through that whistleblower concept, or who have taken steps otherwise to call it make 5 volunteers' jobs much harder. I mean, it's the worst job in town, so I can tell you that. I don't think anybody here would sign up again. It is a miserable. There's nothing happy. You don't get to plant a tree. You don't get to and we don't get to correct legislation because of the politics of it.
That was just going to be a follow-up to my question, about if this was political. And I know this is tough because, we're all volunteers and nothing to do. At this point, do you think that's something that could continue with a volunteer board, or even something like in the earlier part of this discussion, you talked about chasing down the disclosure forms and that becomes time consuming. Do you feel as if this board, at this point, it should be considered to have somebody non-volunteer doing this?
I think truthfully, over the 5 years, I've seen it work really well and really kind. And, it's as a result of this, let's call it the politicalization of this last matter that gave rise to, now we're talking about changing legislation. We've been talking about it for 5 years. So I don't really, I see that as even scarier to the informant, call it. An informant is maybe too big a word. So no, I thought it worked. I didn't really see any I didn't, when I was the young, the new guy on the block and sort of sitting there trying to learn, or I haven't seen that be the problem. I think it would be great to have something in the statute. There's a specific clause in the statute, and I can draw a reference to it if you want to know, that states that anybody who's a public official appointed or elected has to cooperate with the ethics board. Put aside that doesn't happen. Very recently it hasn't. I think it should be mandated that they won't interfere, won't impair. Most of the matters, Mike, don't get to a level of call it a crime, where a public enforcement officer would be necessary. I mean, we have the right to refer things to those type. I haven't seen anything or heard of anything that would get to that level of professional necessity, particularly with, at least I've had the benefit of both Charlie Goldberger and Bob Spolzino, who are both professional, and Christy. Is Christy still on the phone? And Christy. And before her, Kristen Halpin, who have all been very professional, very on top of this, and very lawyerly. So I don't think that would, I think that you might find, I'm not sure, Mike, that might dissuade people from coming forward because it appears to be so consequential.
But sort of, I want to touch base on something that you said earlier about like tracking down closures and getting all of that paperwork in. I mean, couldn't something as simple as some legislation change basically say if you don't have your disclosure in by 30 days after you've signed your oath to office, you can't take your seat?
And that's a great precursor to what I think it might suggest is that tends to happen because when they get seated, if they get seated midterm, you've gotten appointed, Sally gives you the form, you're not feeling your oaths yet, you fill it in. That has not been the problem. The problem is these things are due February 15th, and I could pull this out, but I mean, we've had years recently where only 2 of the village trustees sent it in on time. We've had them where it's taken a month to get. I think it was 2018. So I think the next step in that, your thought, John, which is a good one, and I think that'd be great to legislate. You can't sit, you can't hear, is if you're already seated and you fail to file and you haven't filed, say by March 15th, one might suggest legislation that would say that person, can't sit on a matter. It's
Is unqualified.
yeah, they're deemed recused or whatever word you want to use. And then if they haven't filed by 60, they shouldn't, why do you need 5 people chasing, someone else? It doesn't make any sense. And very
Well, I mean,
rarely, almost never.
But sort of to revisit that, my thinking would be that somebody who doesn't fill out that form, the disclosure form, and doesn't fill it out effectively and intelligently is putting the village in a liability issue. And if I was an applicant and I was going before a board and I knew about these issues, the first thing I would do is ask to see the disclosures of every member of a board if it was contentious. And if they didn't have them filed, it would be a problem for the village.
Well, and the real, I agree with you, but the real issue is if you're showing up there and you're a regular person and you got a
Right.
house and you got to you had a new baby and you want to put a little dormer on and you got to go before the architectural review board and planning, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that you're not going to come in swinging like that. It's really,
No, I agree. But I mean, if it starts to go south on you and you ask for that information and you find out that 3 people who are sitting on a board haven't filled out their disclosure forms, you walk out of there with a feeling of resentment.
100%. We agree. I sort of like the idea. We haven't actually, sort of 30 days in, you don't get to sit, and 60, you're gone kind of thing. Because there's no reason not to. By the way, rarely when these people are delinquent, they don't file on time, is some magic thing hidden that's apparent to us. But it does what's the word when you undermines a system where there are, we've had, in most years I've been on it, I'd say well over half the land use board members don't file. I'm forgetting the tree committee and I'm forgetting the budget committee and rec committee, but we've written memos on this to the BOT, but of course that year they didn't file on time either. There needs to be, a clear consequence for not filing because of really before it gets to an enforcement action or a hassle for an applicant or a liability issue. It's just a damn form. You just fill it in. It's not a hard form to fill in.
Right. So we had come up, I think 2 years ago, with a timetable that we, for the first time, that we tried to adhere to. And basically it was, if you don't file by this date, we're going to hold our breath. And if you don't file by the next day, we're going to hold our breath for twice as long. Eventually I think it came down to, we're going to tell the Board of Trustees, which we ended up doing this year. But you know what, John, that is burdensome for the Board of Ethics and Sally Roberts and toothless. So you're right. On the other hand, if I were an applicant before the zoning board and I was there with my architect or my attorney and I came and there was not a quorum because someone had not filed their financial disclosure form, I'd be really angry.
Which goes back to why there has to be, if you're going to do anything that has any teeth with respect to almost anything in this code, at least land use boards, and this is done in many other jurisdictions. I'm sure you guys will research it, do a better job than we did, but there needs to be the ability to pick an alternate that also, so that people don't feel that they can recuse. You know what I mean? Like, you get vested in these committees, you're working on something and then you realize you have an issue or you got caught or you didn't really think about it because you're working so hard. There needs to be not only the teeth for enforcement, which has a lot of negativity to it, but also a route. We've had in recent times a board which was down to only 3 members, and the pressure to not remove somebody or not to bring up an issue did come up. So your first thought about you don't sit without it is a great one, John, and should just be extended into the process.
Ad hoc committee members, any other questions? Is there a separate, do you keep a discoverable open separate file for your advisory opinions? And if so, where are they kept?
Well, the informal ones aren't kept anywhere, and advisory opinions are confidential.
So there is,
Which is
no-
good, because that lets someone come and say, hey, you know, I don't know about this. My uncle owns the house next door, or, you know, those kind of things.
So somebody might call up and say, I have a quick question for you. And is that response given by a member of the board? Is there some record made of it? Is it?
You know, it's required by law to be confidential, so we know it. You know, there's hopefully some continuity on the board. I mean, my computer.
There isn't a file of anonymized opinions that one might search for guidance?
No, but
particular
I can understand why you'd ask that. Those have not been problem. It wouldn't be a bad thing, but we're so resource constrained and haven't gotten resource. That would not be high on the list, because it's not repeats. It does, at least when I've gotten it, doesn't tend to be repeat stuff. I got a call from somebody about 5 months ago that was on a board, and a house was being moved past their house. And being that didn't really, that's not going to come up again. So no, that is those matters are not, but not allowable. I mean, they're.
Mark, I believe the code allows us to remove the identifying information and disclose the advisory opinions
When it's written.
Redacted format.
Yeah, when it's written.
Yeah.
When it's written, we can do what you said, which is, cleanse it of names. Although the reality is, in this village, anybody here that has served, there's no cleansing, So that wouldn't be a bad thing if resources.
Bless you.
I wouldn't
Thank you.
have that as a priority, Dan, but it's not a bad thought. I mean, in a perfect world, we'd have it.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, you can.
It's not been a problem.
New York State Department of Taxation does that with anonymous issues and that sort of thing. Thank you for that. Thanks for the answer. So do you file an annual report?
Yes, we're getting ready to.
And is that a public document?
Yeah, I think the way we've done it in the last several years, it doesn't read, here's an annual report. We have essentially done it in 3 stages. We've done it as a report of who did or didn't disclose. So for example, this year, we sent a list of 9 folks after 4 months who had not filed for 3 months, went to the board, and I'm not sure what happened after that.
Board of Trustees.
Board of Trustees, right. That's what it requires us to do, is report it to the Board of Trustees. One would assume, to John's point, that if one received that, you would find it troublesome and some action taken. But as you can tell, I'm sure their priorities are difficult too.
But every year you appear before the Board of Trustees and give a spiel about what's going on for the year. So in a sense, it's a public record because it's a public meeting.
Yeah, I have.
And it's on LMC TV.
It's on
Right,
TV.
But you don't
typically I've
submit
done
a
it.
written report, do you? Mark, you don't submit a written report annually. I think we are this year.
We've done it, like I was starting to say, we did in 3 sections. We did who's not following the annual disclosure, because that was a cornerstone, and we didn't want to wait till later to provide that. We have annually, I think in all but 1 year, made a legislative report, which is the summary I'm working on. And we have made, in the context of the legislative suggestions, that has brought to bear our actual annual experience, because it's out of that experience. I promise you, we're not sitting around intellectualizing, we're too damn busy to intellectualize this. That we come to them with legislation that we think is necessary based on our firsthand experience. So that's available. The legislative thing, if when I get done with it in a week or something, the legislative thing will save you hours of time of going through looking for stuff.
Would you, is it appropriate for you to provide us with a copy of that?
Yeah, I will, of course. That's what I was saying. So when I get done with it, because it'll be part of this year's annual report, it will be public, and I think that'll help you guys a lot. It'll also give you a sense of how narrow the legislative issues are. Maybe we've made a suggestion of 1 or 2 a year, which on a statute that's 11 years old is not an overwhelming request or learning on our part that something had to be changed. I'll give you an example of something else that just popped in my head that suggested that I think would be really a great idea. I think in the recusal statute, it says, and this came up in the Santoro matter, and it's come up elsewhere in questions, is that when you recuse, the statute says no further participation. If you've read, section, I think it's 21(4)(c), maybe it is, something like that. We had asked, as an example, it just popped in my head, that further participation should mean that you step off the dais, leave the room, and don't discuss the matter with your fellow trustees, or with knowledge that you're sending information to your fellow trustees or board members once you're recused. That's the kind of thing we would have thought was a layup to say yes to.
Generally, how many matters do you handle in a given year?
Depends what you call them. Let's put it, you want to take out the annual disclosure, Chase? Take out the annual disclosure compliance. I mean, like I said, in my 5 years, we had, I take you through each one. We've had, I believe, 2 formal hearings, which means those each had investigations to them. That was Santoro and Goldstein. We've had 2, maybe it's, I'm trying to remember if it's 3. I have the list on my, I'm not sure how to pull something up and still see you guys. I think we've had, in that whole period of time, other than those 2, 1 or 2 other investigations where, essentially, put it in the colloquial terms, we didn't find a reason for further action and the matter was dropped, no public disclosure. So we don't have a volume of matters. This notion of wide-ranging investigations or anything like that is just not the case. So we do have, I'd say, pretty regularly informal questions, but nothing that you would think of, Dan, I think, in the way you use the word, a matter. Very.
I was getting more at a flow of questions that you get, and when you get them, do you convene on a regular basis to discuss the matters that have arisen in the last week, and do you keep a docket of inquiries, which of course would be confidential, but when you get a inquiry, do you record it and docket it?
We could go back and talk about the confidentiality part of it. A lot of these inquiries come from generally very well-meaning staff. I live in a building, it turns out that they're going to be renovating it and I'm the village planner. What do I do? That would be an example. I'm just making it up. That would be it. So there's no real, we'll discuss it. Some of the questions are obvious. You know, I want to make a gift, or I want to go I want to go to a charity thing, you know, but where it's clear on, it's not really an issue. It's just lack of education. We've all answered those. But if it's anything more, we go to the group and discuss it, but it's not kept in a, as far as I know, it's never been kept in a vault somewhere.
Is
And
there a process by which the responses, like if someone contacts one member of the board for advisory, do they answer, or do they consult with the rest of the board before responding, just to ensure that individually there weren't separate answers or different answers for other situations? Like how, like, I'm just trying to envision the access to the board, or everything that comes, to Dan's point, is discussed for that week or for that period of time since you've last met before, you know, I assume some of these things need immediate response, but just what it's the process.
There's things come up that are self-obvious, like, should I disclose this? And it's closed. Well, you'd be better off disclosing if you're comfortable, and they do it. So then it's reported and there's nothing. But it, you know, when we've had requests, I'm trying to remember, Debbie, Yoram, Jeff, I don't know if have you guys ever written or been part of a written advisory? Have we gotten since you guys have been on the board, gotten a request for a written advisory opinion?
We did. We had the example that you gave of the person that had the house being moved past their property,
Right.
For example. And I thought our process worked very well, which is you'd forward along whatever the information you received from the person was, and we'd schedule a meeting. You know, obviously with the open meeting law issues, we'd address those, go into executive session and agree as a group how to give the advisory opinion. And typically it seemed what we did is someone would be tasked with notifying the person what the ultimate advisory opinion would be, so we could act timely. And then as a group, we'd sign off on some language in terms of formalizing it in a written format. But that's typically the process that we followed.
I also don't think that people call up various members and ask them something and they give opinions. We almost do everything together and talk about it. So we don't, if there's a perception that people call us separately, that's not, everything's brought before all of us.
There's nothing, for example, Jocelyn, there's nothing when I get, because I'm the chair, I get the calls.
Yeah.
I'd love someone else to get it. I don't think there's anything that's ever come up unless it was so embarrassing and so difficult for the person. But I can't think of one of those where we as a group have been very transparent and fluid amongst us.
There was no perception, just to be clear. It was just, I'm trying to envision how people or employees access you. So that was the reason behind my.
The more interesting thing about advisory opinions is why people don't access it. We have,
yeah, that was my point early on.
Yoram have been on this point because, you know, we have had behavior or conduct or actions where a simple advisory opinion could have at least made what might have been helpful. But I think that you don't have people ask you for the advisory opinions, or informal things are almost always, Jocelyn, is this okay? I want to know. It's not particularly, we haven't had them that are particularly difficult or taxing. It's never the person who you might perceive as someone who would violate the statute who asked you the advisory opinion. We wish they would, because it would work out. It would be sensible.
I take it you haven't been in a situation, or have you been in a situation where someone said, well, look, the committee, they committed an act which appeared to be a violation of the code, and said, oh, but I got John Doe from the Board of Ethics said I could do this. The Board of Ethics said I could do this.
No, and we've also never given an advisory opinion where the person would, just ignored it. We have had cases where, when matters have come up and we have, it's not like we just go out and, like, we're not trolling meetings. Like, I've never looked at one meeting in 5 years without somebody saying you need to look at a meeting. I prefer to watch, NCIS or the news, or, George Carlin reruns, so no, there's no trolling, and there's also, what I would say is the cases that have most surprised me about advisory opinions is where someone is doing something that is, it's readily clear it's a statutory issue, readily clear. That's why you're sitting there in a room talking, and you suggest that you go ask for an advisory opinion, because then you have village attorney, and we have an appellate judge who's the village attorney. He's excellent at this stuff. And Charlie was great at it, where they choose not to do so. That's always baffling to me.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I actually have to leave, but I just wanted to say thank you very much to everybody, and I apologize for having to take off.
Yeah, I think we've taken a good deal of time, and I'm very conscious of it. So I think we can, barring anything urgent, I think we can adjourn. Is that okay with members of the ad hoc committee?
Absolutely.
And I think it might, if you want to discuss this again, in the context of reviewing the actual legislation, we're happy to do it with you. I would just say that so much of what has happened here that led to the formation of your committee, the comments made from the dais aren't grounded. I'm not saying having you guys, we're glad you're there, because maybe you'll be able to achieve what we haven't been able to over a decade. But this came out of a fractious political environment, which I think getting the politics out of the ethics board. There is no politics I've ever seen within the ethics board. This board, the prior board, but to shield the influence of elected people who have stakes in the fate of other people that aren't grounded in, evidence would be a good step forward. That would be healthy.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. This has been enormously helpful.
All right.
Good luck.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, guys.
You.
Good night.
Mark, do you want us to stay on and we'll do the formalities of closing the meeting?
Sure. Thanks for reminding me. I almost closed.
Yep. Oh, good.
Okay. So I guess that's it. I'm working on this report. I will circulate it to you guys within the next handful of days. We are expecting, I believe, that the next memo of law in the Goldstein matter is due. I think it's the 14th. It might be the 17th. We'll see that. And I thought it was useful to wait to file whatever we file until that has occurred. So that's all I have. I'll take a motion to close unless someone's got other business.
I'll make that motion.
We are very grateful to you.
I'll second.
Any opposed? All in favor?
Certainly not. All in favor, raise your right hand.
Aye.
Night, guys.
Thank you all.
Peace, love.
See you guys.
Thanks, Sally. Hey, Sally,
Yeah.
stay on for 1 second. I'll do what you asked me to do.
Okay, but I'm going to stop the live streaming.
All right, no one else is on, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to stop it. It looks great.
I think there are people on, Mark.
All right. See you later.
It's okay. See you
Sally,
later.
thanks for everything.
Take care.